Questions today about whether the government's doctor-assisted dying bill complies with the Charter. Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould touched off the debate by sending a notice to all parliamentarians last night, urging narrow restrictions around eligibility. She maintains the government has leeway to craft legislation as it sees fit. Indeed, the Supreme Court indicated that much. But she also says that if it doesn't mirror the language of the landmark Supreme Court case, that's okay too. Does the bill meet constitutional standards as it stands, or are amendments required to make it Charter compliant? Joining me now from the foyer of the House of Commons, Sean Casey, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Justice Minister. Michael Cooper is the Deputy Conservative Justice Critic, and Murray Rankin is the NDP's Justice Critic. So just so people are aware of where this bill is at, because we're still in a waiting game, or you guys are still in a waiting game a little bit, the Senate is still going through amendments and still voting on them. Most recently just passed one by Senator Marshall, so we're now up to 4 amendments that have been passed by the Senate. You're waiting to get it back, perhaps as early as Thursday, to assess what's there. But before we get into some of those things, I want to start with you, Sean Casey, on this issue that the Justice Minister raised, and have you explain to me how a legislation that is a response to a Supreme Court decision could be Charter compliant, but not necessarily Carter compliant.
Sure. In the Carter decision, there were 2 specific plaintiffs. There were specific provisions of the criminal code that had a legislative record and that had a set of objectives. What the court found was that the provisions in the code were too broad to meet their objectives. What will come before the court if and when C-14 is challenged is a different statute that has different objectives, that has different measures. The test of constitutionality will be whether the measures contained in C-14 meet the objectives, which will not be the same objectives that were in the Carter decision. So that's what we had in Carter was a specific situation where the court found that the measures contained in the criminal code were overbroad. An absolute prohibition was broader than what was necessary to protect the vulnerable, but the objectives of C-14 are broader than simply the protection of the vulnerable. They take into account the public health risk of suicide. They take into account the stigma associated with those who are ill, disabled, and elderly, and it also takes into account the public interest in not having death as an option for all suffering.
Okay.
And so against those objectives, this will be measured, and we believe that it will stand up to the test of constitutionality, which will be a different consideration than what was before the court in Carter.
Okay, but and you're the lawyer, I'm not. But wouldn't the Carter decision be the floor for what the Supreme Court would accept? And I would argue that maybe that's not where you have started it. So if the Supreme Court is, I mean, it's first of all, it sounds like the government's admitting, you know, this will be challenged by someone in terms of constitutionality. But if the requirements laid out in that decision are sort of the bare minimum of what the Supreme Court is willing to accept, why not use that as the starting point for the conversation?
In 1999, the Supreme Court ruled in a case of R versus Mills that it's not impingent, it's not required for the government to slavishly comply with the wording in a Supreme Court decision. There is a dialogue that happens between the court and between Parliament. One of the things that Carter said was that it's Parliament that is best placed to determine the objectives and to determine the regime that is required, and that the court will show deference to that. So it isn't a question of cutting and pasting. Parliament has a wider latitude than that, and that is well recognized in the jurisprudence.
Okay, Michael Cooper, let's get you to weigh in on that. I don't know if it's admission might be framing it the wrong way, but that statement by both Sean Casey and the Justice Minister that it could be constitutional, but not exactly what the Supreme Court laid out in the Carter decision. Do you agree that it could be both those things?
Well, in the Carter decision, the Supreme Court set out fairly broad parameters. In other words, they gave Parliament a lot of room to legislate. And I believe that the legislation satisfies the broad parameters of Carter. And in the Carter decision itself, the Supreme Court expressly stated that a high degree of deference would be afforded to the decision of Parliament in the way of a legislative response in terms of implementing a complex regulatory regime. So, yes, I believe that Parliament does have a fair bit of flexibility. And to your point about whether the legislation will be challenged, look, the legislation will be challenged presumably from all different angles. Stopping passing legislation because it could be challenged, I mean, if that was the test, we might as well just not pass legislation because it is going to be challenged from all different sides.
Okay, Murray Rankin, on this issue around the government's contention that this is constitutional, even if it doesn't really necessarily respond in a direct way to the Carter decision.
I don't buy it, Rosie. I don't buy it at all. I mean, the case in Carter was a charter case. It involved finding that Section 7 of the Charter struck down sections in circumstances that were before the court, not simply two individuals as the government would have it, but interveners from the Civil Liberties Association brought many more cases to bear. Now look, as of right now, because we don't have C-14 in place, people who are not terminally ill, not facing reasonably foreseeable natural death, have the right to avail themselves of medical assistance in dying. The moment this law passes, if the government's going to ram it through without any of the amendments the Senate has brought forward and others have proposed like myself, that person will no longer, who's not terminal, be able to avail themselves of the remedy that the court provided. How can that not be a significant problem for the government? It's not constitutional what they're doing. Peter Hogg said it, Joe Arvey said it, the BC Civil Liberties Association, the Canadian Bar, the Quebec Bar. I don't know what else they need.
Okay, well let me just, I want to dig into at least one of the amendments that didn't get passed. But Sean Casey, just respond to that. I mean, isn't legislation supposed to, and the Charter for that matter, supposed to treat all Canadians equally? And are we not in a situation now where we have some Canadians being treated one way, and once the legislation is in place, a different way?
Well, the legislation is designed to put in place a system that balances the rights, that balances the need to provide a personal autonomy and to protect the vulnerable. That's the job of Parliament. The court said that's the job of Parliament, and that's exactly what we've set out to do. As was indicated, look, the court didn't say that it's upon Parliament to pass one of the most permissive regimes in the world. The court did not say that. And this is a decision that's been taken very seriously. It's a huge step. We've decided to proceed along a path that all jurisdictions outside of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg have chosen. That's the balancing that we've decided to take at this point in our history, and we think it's the best solution.
Okay, well, let me, sorry, who wanted in there?
I wanted in. If I can just say, you know, we're not here to figure out whether it's too strong or too weak or this or that. We're here to implement a unanimous Supreme Court of Canada decision. And it's not for Parliament. Certainly we can put new restrictions on procedures and add new safeguards. I'm all for that. But to take away rights that certain people acquired in that case is just wrong. And that's what Peter Hogg and others have said.
But
you just can't do that.
But then, Murray Rankin, what do you say to Sean Casey's point about, you know, Parliament being slavish to Supreme Court rulings? You can't be taking all direction from the Supreme Court either.
I agree. The safest thing is to put the language of the court in these circumstances rather than inventing some new language that nobody knows what it means. But it's true. We don't have to follow the precise language. That's been clear for many, many years since the Mills case that he referred to. Absolutely right.
Okay.
But you can't take rights away that people won in a court case.
Okay. So then what about this issue of advance directives? Now, this was one of the amendments that did not go through. That's been all voted down so far in the Senate and has not been part of the legislation the government put forward. But Senator Cowan, for instance, believes as well that this issue, if they are not allowed, if you are not allowed to indicate, you know, that if you have Alzheimer's disease, you will at a certain point want to have access to medically assisted dying, that too will create two tiers of patients, and that too will open up charter challenges. Sean Casey.
Well, the question of advance directives was one that was debated in committee, and amendments were proposed that were rejected, the same on the floor of the House of Commons. There has been a commitment made to study the question of advance directives. Rosie, what you need to know is that advance directives are in place in one European country where they are actually very rarely relied upon. So you talk about opening up a regime that would be the most permissive in the world. We're just not prepared to go there yet. We feel that C-14 provides the right solution for Canada right now. It includes a provision for us to study that issue and to collect data from the Canadian experience that will better inform the decisions that we make once we have some experience with the C-14 regime.
Michael Cooper, what do you make of the Senate's contention that without advance directives, you again are going to run into some charter issues?
I think that if you want to respect the parameters of Carter, which many have talked about, then in order to do that, you should not include advance directives. The Supreme Court talked about physician-assisted dying being available to persons who are suffering from a grievous and irremediable condition, not persons who anticipate that they will suffer from a grievous and irremediable condition. So from the standpoint of following Carter, I don't think you can include advance directives. Now, it is a complex issue. I know that in the province of Quebec, over the 6-year period, over 3 national assemblies and 3 different governments, advance directives were initially included in Bill 52. They were ultimately taken out because Quebec legislators were not satisfied that the inherent risks involved could be sufficiently mitigated. So I'm all in favor of studying the issue, but I think to do it at this time, having regard for the complexity, would be premature and would put potentially vulnerable Canadians at risk.
Murray Rankin on that issue.
Well, I'm disappointed that they didn't go further. The report that was commissioned by the Senate and House committee looked at that and concluded in narrow circumstances, advance directives would make sense. I believe that the Carter case is a floor, not a ceiling, and I understand and agree with Michael Cooper that it's not consistent right with within the parameters of Carter to do advance directives, but it's certainly open to Parliament to go there should it wish to do so. It's a political choice for Parliament to make. I know a lot of Canadians are going to be very disappointed that we didn't go there.
Okay, Sean Casey, I'll leave it on this. So we're up to 4 amendments now. The Senate could send it back as early as, I think you would get it by Thursday. Is the government going to allow for full debate on these amendments?
I expect that there will be full debate. To be honest, Rosie, that's a decision that will be made, I think, in part with the government House leaders, but certainly there has been a lot of debate so far. Some of the amendments we've seen before, some of them introduced new concepts. I think it's fair to say that there will be a healthy amount of debate. What constitutes full debate, we can argue about.
Yes. Okay, all right. Well, gentlemen, I'll leave it there, and I know we'll talk again. Sean Casey, Michael Cooper, Murray Rankin, I appreciate your very respectful tone on this important story, too, so thank you for that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie.
Okay. More on this story next hour.